The blockade began without warning when alien warships slid into orbit around Earth like cold metal shadows, their engines silent and their weapons powered but not firing. And across the planet, billions of people looked up at the same sky and felt the same pressure settle over their lives as every satellite feed cut to a single transmission, showing the seal of the Galactic Accord and a tall insectoid figure speaking in a calm voice that treated humanity like a slow child, explaining that Earth had violated trade expectations, cultural protocols, and expansion limits, and that the blockade was not an act of war, but a lesson meant to teach compliance. And in government rooms across the world, leaders listened in silence as supply ships vanished at the edge of the system. Communication relays were jammed, and off-world colonies went dark one by one, while in Washington, Admiral John Carter stood with his hands behind his back staring at a tactical display that showed hundreds of hostile contacts holding perfect formation. And beside him, Secretary Elaine Brooks asked how long the planet could last without imports, and Carter answered with a steady voice that Earth could survive, but only if they were allowed to prepare, which they were not, because the aliens wanted fear, not destruction. And in the alien command vessel high, Executive Rail watched Earth through layers of sensors and felt satisfied because humans were reacting exactly as predicted, panicking governments, arguing, civilians, and no immediate military response, confirming the Council's belief that humanity was technologically behind and emotionally unstable, a species that needed correction, not negotiation. And so days passed with rationing beginning and news networks filled with arguments while the blockade ships adjusted their orbits to cut off solar traffic and mining routes. And still Earth did not fire a single shot, not because it could not, but because deep under the planet and across hidden installations, Admiral Carter and a small group of officers were activating protocols that had never been acknowledged in public records, protocols built during decades of being ignored by the galaxy. And in a quiet underground chamber, Dr. Samuel Wright monitored reactors that had never been registered with any council, reactors designed to power fleets that officially did not exist. And he told Carter that systems were coming online ahead of schedule, which surprised Carter but did not change his calm expression, because the lesson humanity had learned long ago was patience. And while the aliens watched cities dim their lights to save power and interpreted it as weakness, human factories shifted production to subterranean lines. Crews were recalled to seal bases, and training simulations became live drills, all without a single broadcast or signal leaving the planet. And on the alien flagship Vrail, met with his advisors who recommended tightening the blockade further to increase pressure. But Vrail waved the suggestion away and said humans needed time to understand their place, and that fear would do the work better than force. And so the blockade continued, not knowing that every hour it remained gave humanity exactly what it needed, time to prepare the response that would turn a lesson into a mistake, so severe the galaxy would remember it for generations. As the second week of the blockade settled in, the mood on Earth shifted from confusion to controlled resolve, and that change was invisible to the alien sensors watching from orbit because it happened in places they did not monitor, in buried command centers, sealed shipyards hollowed into asteroids pulled quietly into lunar shadow decades earlier, and in the minds of people who had grown up knowing that the galaxy existed but had chosen to ignore them. And Admiral John Carter convened a restricted council that did not include politicians or media figures, only those who already knew the truth about what humanity had built in silence. And as the doors sealed, he told them the blockade was never about trade or protocol, but about establishing dominance. And that meant the aliens would never accept negotiation once fear had been applied. So Earth would not beg and would not rush. And around the table, captains and engineers listened as Carter laid out a simple strategy built on deception and restraint. Because the greatest advantage humans had was that the enemy believed they had none. And in a separate facility, Dr. Samuel Wright briefed a team of scientists on final system synchronizations, explaining that the drives they were about to activate bent physics in ways the Council believed impossible, not because it violated known laws, but because no other species had thought to combine redundancy, brute force engineering, and human tolerance for risk. And while reactors hummed and hulls were pressurized, civilian life above ground adjusted to ration schedules and rolling blackouts, which the alien observers recorded as signs of decline, and High Executive Rail reviewed reports that showed minor unrest and political disputes across human nations, and concluded the lesson was working perfectly, remarking to his subordinates that humans lacked unity and would fracture under sustained pressure. And he authorized a public statement reducing allowed energy output to planetary grids, confident that further discomfort would force surrender, not realizing that the restriction triggered a cascade of internal switches across Earth's infrastructure, routing power away from civilian networks and into hidden channels feeding shipyards and weapon platforms. And when the lights dimmed in major cities, thousands of technicians underground smiled grimly because the final constraint had been removed, and deep within a hollowed section of the moon, Captain Laura Bennett walked the length of a massive hangar where dark-hulled vessels rested without insignia, their surfaces matte and unreflective, and she placed a hand against the cold metal of her ship and whispered that it was almost time, because every human there understood the unspoken rule they had lived by for generations, that survival did not require permission, and while the galaxy watched her struggle under a blockade meant to teach obedience, humanity quietly finished preparing the answer that would redefine the meaning of the word mistake. By the start of the third week, the alien blockade tightened into what High Executive Rail considered its final instructional phase, with patrol patterns shortened and enforcement drones deployed to intercept even unmanned probes. And from his perspective, the data was reassuring, because Earth traffic had nearly vanished and energy missions were trending downward, a textbook example of compliant species approaching submission. And he transmitted a message to the Galactic Accord stating that human resistance was minimal and that formal capitulation was expected within days. But on Earth, the same week marked the transition from preparation to execution, as Admiral John Carter authorized the silent dispersal of assets that had never been counted as ships because they had never existed on any public registry. And from beneath oceans, deserts, and ice fields, vessels rose on columns of contained force, not breaking atmosphere in the traditional sense, but slipping through layers of space, as if the planet itself were letting go of them. And in one of the deepest command centers, Elaine Brooks watched status lights turn from dormant to active and felt a tight calm settle in her chest, because for the first time since the blockade began, humanity was no longer waiting. And Dr. Samuel Wright confirmed that drive harmonics were stable across the fleet, adding that alien sensors would struggle to track them once engaged because the ships did not move along predictable vectors. A design choice born from centuries of human pilots dying in early test programs and engineers refusing to accept clean theory over messy survival. And while the fleet positioned itself in cold silence, Captain Laura Bennett received final instructions that were almost disappointingly simple. Do not fire unless fired upon. Do not transmit. Do not reveal capabilities until ordered, because the goal was not to win a battle, but to change an assumption. And as human vessels settled into the shadows of the blockade perimeter, the alien crews noticed nothing unusual, attributing minor sensor noise to solar interference and their own drones. And Vrail held a briefing where he reminded his officers that humans were not to be destroyed unless necessary, because the purpose was control, not extinction, a statement that would later be remembered with bitter irony. And across the fleet, human crews waited without speeches or ceremonies, listening to the steady rhythm of machines. They trusted more than hope, knowing that when the first move came, it would not look like desperation or rage, but like a quiet correction delivered with overwhelming certainty. The fourth week opened with what the alien command logged as an anomaly and what humanity understood as the opening of the lesson's reversal, because at precisely the same moment across the blockade perimeter, several patrol ships experienced synchronized sense of blindness that lasted less than a second, too brief to trigger alarms, yet long enough for human vessels to shift position by distances that should have been impossible. And when the data buffers refreshed, the alien officers dismissed it as a calibration fault, unaware that Captain Laura Bennett had just maneuvered her ship from lunar shadow to the heart of the blockade grid without leaving a trace. And back on Earth, Admiral John Carter watched the same moment on his display and allowed himself a single slow breath, knowing the fleet was exactly where it needed to be. And High Executive Rail received a report about the anomaly and responded with irritation rather than concern, instructing his technicians to tighten diagnostics and reminding them that human technology could not challenge Accord standards, a belief so deeply rooted it filtered every observation that contradicted it. And so when a human ship drifted close enough to map the internal structure of an alien cruiser, using passive systems alone, the aliens interpreted the faint distortions as background radiation. And when another human vessel positioned itself directly between two enforcement platforms without triggering proximity alerts, the aliens congratulated themselves on the discipline of their crews. And inside the human fleet, the tension was sharp, but controlled as crews executed maneuvers that violated every known engagement doctrine taught by the galaxy, because their ships were not designed to dominate space through intimidation but survive and adapt under conditions where intimidation failed. And Dr. Samuel Wright monitored feedback from experimental systems that converted waste energy into localized field distortions, allowing ships to appear exactly where the enemy least expected them, a capability that had been tested only in simulations because no one had believed the galaxy would ever force humanity to reveal it, and on the alien flagship Vrail prepared a final transmission demanding Earth's formal submission within 48 hours, confident that the species below was exhausted and isolated, while at that same moment Carter authorized the quiet activation of planetary defenses that had been written, off in council databases as outdated debris fields, turning dormant orbital platforms into active nodes linked directly to the hidden fleet, and across space a trap closed so gently that the ones inside it never felt the jaws begin to move. The fifth phase unfolded without the dramatic explosion the alien commanders expected from a desperate species, and that absence of panic was a first sign something had gone terribly wrong. Because when High Executive Rail transmitted the final ultimatum to Earth demanding surrender, within 48 hours the response did not come from a civilian authority or a political council, but from a narrow-band signal that pierced the blockade as if it were not there, and when its technicians decoded it, they found no threats and no pleas. Only a calm statement delivered in clear, basic trade language that said Earth acknowledged the blockade had served its purpose, and that further enforcement actions would be interpreted as hostile intent, a phrasing so controlled and precise that it unsettled several officers on the bridge. But Vrail dismissed the discomfort and ordered a limited demonstration strike against an unmanned orbital platform to reinforce the lesson, believing that visible force would restore psychological dominance. And as the alien cruiser powered its weapons-of-human fleet, received the same data, and Captain Laura Bennett watched the targeting sequence unfold with detached focus, because the demonstration the aliens intended was exactly what Admiral John Carter had planned for, and the moment the alien weapon discharged, it did not strike its target because the space between the cruiser and the platform folded inward, not violently but decisively, and the energy dispersed harmlessly into a field that should not have existed. And across the blockade, dozens of alien ships experienced cascading system errors as their targeting solutions collapsed. And for the first time, alarms rang on alien bridges, not from incoming fire, but from internal contradictions in their own sensors. And Vrail demanded an explanation as reports flooded in describing human vessels appearing on scopes and vanishing again without acceleration signatures, and then appearing closer, and then in psi formations thought to be secure, and still no human weapons fired, which created growing unease because the galaxy's doctrine taught that restraint signaled weakness, not confidence, and Dr. Samuel Wright's voice echoed through human command channels, confirming that the demonstration had achieved full effect and that alien fleet coherence was degrading faster than projections. And Elaine Brooks authorized the release of controlled information to civilian networks on Earth, not to incite fear but to stabilize morale, explaining simply that the blockade was no longer absolute and that supplies would resume soon. And when ships carrying food and medical equipment slipped through the alien lines untouched, the truth became impossible to ignore because the blockade was no longer a wall, but suggestion. And High Executive Rail realized with tightening sensation that the lesson he had intended to teach had reversed its direction, and that humanity was no longer responding to the blockade, but allowing it to continue only because it chose to, and that understanding marked the precise moment the mistake became irreversible. The sixth stage began as confusion spread through the alien ranks, and discipline, once their greatest strength, started to fracture under information they could not reconcile, because their sensors showed humans everywhere and nowhere at once, and their command logic had no framework for an enemy that refused to behave according to fear-based escalation. And High Executive Rail attempted to reassert control by ordering a full fleet realignment, believing that mass formation would restore superiority. But as ships moved, they found themselves subtly guided into positions they had not chosen, drifting along vectors that felt correct to their navigation systems but placed them at slight disadvantages relative to one another. And on Earth, Admiral John Carter observed the pattern forming exactly as predicted, a living diagram of alien doctrine turning into a liability, and he authorized the first overt reveal not as an attack, but as a statement, and across every alien channel, Single human vessel powered up its drives in full view, not aggressively, simply existing in a way that violated known limits, holding position without visible thrust, radiating controlled energy signatures that dwarfed individual cruisers yet remained perfectly stable, and Captain Laura Bennett addressed the alien fleet with a voice that was steady and unraised, explaining that the blockade had been instructive for humanity as well, because it confirmed that the galaxy still believed power came from intimidation rather than understanding, and she stated plainly that Earth had no intention of destroying the fleet, but would remove it if necessary, a conditional frame not as a threat, but as an inevitability. And among the alien crews, panic began to surface as officers argued over whether the human ship was a superweapon or a decoy, while Vrail struggled to issue orders through a command net clogged with conflicting data, and Dr. Samuel Wright confirmed that human systems were now openly rewriting local space conditions, not tearing them apart, but shaping them. A technological approach the Council had dismissed as inefficient because it required accepting losses during development, something only humans have been willing to endure, and when an alien destroyer attempted to retreat, it found its path gently closed, not by a force field, but by the absence of viable space. A corridor of probabilities narrowed until only stillness remained, and that ship did not explode or shut down, but simply waited, intact and powerless. And the psychological impact rippled faster than any weapon because the fleet realized they were not under attack. They were under control, and the lesson humanity had absorbed over centuries of being underestimated was finally delivered back to the galaxy in a form it could not ignore. The seventh movement of the confrontation unfolded as the alien fleet crossed from fear into comprehension. And that transition was more devastating than any loss of hulls because it stripped away the certainty that had defined their place in the galaxy. And High Executive Rail stood on his bridge watching human ships hold the blockade in a suspended state that no longer served its original purpose. And for the first time since his ascent, he questioned the core belief of the Accord that lesser species would always break before authority. And he opened a channel to Captain Laura Bennett not to threaten, but to ask what humanity wanted. A question that carried the weight of an entire doctrine collapsing, and Bennett answered without hesitation that Earth wanted the blockade lifted, its colonies reconnected, and formal recognition that humanity would never again be subjected to corrective force without consequence. And the simplicity of the demand unsettled the alien counselors listening. And because it carried no ambition for conquest, only a boundary clearly drawn. And as negotiations began in real time across secure channels, the human fleet maintained its quiet dominance, occasionally adjusting positions to prevent unauthorized movements, not aggressively, but with the patience of something that knew it could wait longer than its opponent. And on Earth, Elaine Brooks coordinated with global leaders to resume trade and stabilize markets, deliberately avoiding triumphalist messaging because the objective was permanence, not spectacle. And Dr. Samuel Wright oversaw the gradual rollback of active systems to demonstrate control rather than dependence on constant pressure, a gesture that alien analysts noted with growing unease because it implied reserves still untouched. And within the alien fleet, individual captains began filing internal reports acknowledging that their ships had been outmaneuvered without direct combat, a concept that would force the Accord to rewrite centuries of tactical theory. And Vrail, faced with mounting evidence and the risk of total mobilization, authorized the lifting of the blockade under the justification of mission completion, a face-saving phrase that fooled no one present. And as alien ships powered down enforcement drones and opened lanes for traffic, human vessels did not pursue or celebrate. They simply held position until the last restriction was removed. And in that restraint, the galaxy glimpsed the most unsettling truth of all, that humanity did not need to dominate openly to be dominant, and that the greatest mistake was not blockading Earth, but assuming the response would look like desperation rather than control. The final stage arrived not with battle but with consequence, as the alien fleet withdrew in orderly silence, and the space around Earth returned to a normalcy that now felt altered forever, and High Executive Rail transmitted a closing report to Galactic, a court that avoided blame yet could not hide the shift in tone, acknowledging that humanity possessed strategic and technological capabilities previously unaccounted for, and recommending immediate reevaluation of all assumptions regarding human limits, a document that would circulate to the galaxy and quietly reshape policy long after his command ended. And on Earth, Admiral John Carter stood down the hidden fleet in phases, returning ships to shadows and sealed docks because visibility was no longer required now that the point had been made. And Elaine Brooks addressed the world with a measured statement confirming the end of the blockade and the restoration of off-world contact, emphasizing unity and preparedness rather than victory, because humanity understood that survival depended on memory as much as strength, and Dr. Samuel Wright recorded the final system shutdowns with tired satisfaction, knowing that the technologies revealed were only a fraction of what existed, a deliberate choice to leave questions unanswered, and Captain Laura Bennett guided her ship back towards concealed berth, reflecting that the most powerful moment of the entire confrontation had not been when humans took control of space, but when they chose not to press further, and across the galaxy alien academies dissected the incident in lectures that struggled to explain how a species dismissed as slow and divided had outthought and outmaneuvered a unified armada without firing a decisive shot, and traitors diplomats, and explorers began speaking of Earth with a new caution, not as a threat to be crushed or a resource to be exploited, but as a force that responded proportionally and remembered everything. And in that shift, the true outcome became clear, because the blockade meant to teach humanity obedience instead taught the galaxy restraint. And the lesson was written not in wreckage or conquest, but in a simple enduring truth that spread quietly from system to system, that humanity had been underestimated once, and it would never happen again.